Hi, I'm Anne Verdeniger, and today is the second of the lecture series in image design and composition. So you remember last lecture I introduced you to the basic elements of composition, that's line, shape, form and repetition and pattern. And at that time I suggested to you that the secret to becoming familiar with these elements is to go out and find them, photograph them and to start to use them in your images. If you followed this advice, you'll be prepared for the next step, which is developing an understanding for the principles of composition. Before I talk to you about theory behind the placement and organisation of elements of image design, I would like to finalise the conversation about visual elements of composition and image design by introducing you to the concepts of rhythm, framing and unity. So remember, a single element such as line, shape and form, when repeated, becomes a pattern. But depending on how those singular elements are spaced or placed in a photograph will change the rhythm or the impact of the dynamics of the photograph. So that is, the interval between the repeated element will change its dynamic. This rhythm can be regular, flowing or progressive. So what do I mean? Let's look at some examples. Regular rhythm is when an element is repeated sequentially at similar intervals and in a straight line, for example a fence line. The elements may be of similar size and shape. Flowing rhythm suggests movement, that is, the elements may be moving along a more organic or curved path. With progressive rhythm, the elements may seem to overlap as they progress along either a straight or curved line. Progressive movement is evident in the work of the cubists and suggests moments of frozen movement. The first photograph that we're going to have a look at is one taken by David Moore, and it's such a simple image, but he saw and recognised the possibility. From a high vantage point, the nuns with their large white hats set against a dark floor become abstracted form. They look more like birds in flight. The random arrangement and regular intervals between the objects create an energetic rhythm to this photograph. This is a great example of flowing rhythm. Because I use the photographs from some of our greatest masters, sometimes I like to also show student work just to provide some perspective. I'd like you to look at this photograph captured by Haruko Kurihara as part of her first year folio in 2014. Normally, when these ferns are photographed, it's the gentle curve, the length of the frond, which is highlighted. However, the student has seen the value of using the edge of the fern to create a pattern with the fronds, which in turn have a circular pattern of the spores. Haruko has used shallow depth of field to eliminate any focus on the background. It is, however, the different lengths and the occasional water droplet at the end of the ferns fronds that provide a lovely regular rhythm to the image. So Michael Kanner's photographic style makes it so easy to explain rhythm. The trees in this photograph are all about the same size and shape, which form a pattern. Interestingly, the centre tree appears a little denser or darker than the others. This creates a hinge point or symmetry point to the photograph. The lines of the trees, spaced evenly across the snow-covered landscape, are a great example of regular rhythm in a horizontal format. Another photograph from Michael Kanner, but this time it's an example of progressive rhythm. The camera angle when photographing this jetty has created deep perspective. The regular placement of the jetty timbers creates a pattern which converges as it moves towards the horizon. Where the timbers of the jetty begin to converge, they appear to overlap. It is this overlap which illustrates progressive rhythm. This beautifully organic pattern of snow-covered fields in the landscape is the final photograph from Michael Kanner. It's a great example of flowing rhythm. The shapes are similar, so they appear to belong together. Kanner has chosen an angle of view so that many of the lines flow away from the camera position. I've added two more photographs from Michael Kanner to these examples. Can you see and identify the rhythm created by the repeated elements? The next concept I'd like to show you is framing. This is a concept in image design which describes the use of structures, natural or man-made, to create a border or frame around the central subject matter, in camera as you photograph. Sometimes described as looking through, it's a simple way to direct the viewer's gaze, limit the area of view, and it can also provide a contrast to the central part of the photograph. It assists the viewer to understand what is the most important element in the photograph. Using this compositional element of framing requires very careful planning as you photograph. You may have to actually experiment with some camera angles or vantage points to get it right. But let's have a look at some examples to help you understand this concept better. In this first photograph, Nick Rains has used the archway or doorway to the temple to frame the background structure. Notice the similarity in the shape between the archway and the minaret on the top of the background building. Notice the frame is much darker than the background area of the photograph. Framing of the building in the background of the photograph was only one compositional element used to make this a successful image. It is assisted by the elements of line, shape, pattern and repetition. Lines and pattern created by the tiles leads the eye directly to the most important part of the photograph. The small figure to the left gives some hint at the size and proportion of the structures. Lastly, the building in the background is shrouded in what I would assume could be mist. This only adds to the mystery of the image through the use of different tonal values. The following images are part of my work and they're part of my honours exhibition, which featured desolate and deserted man-made structures. This is the old morgue at Ravenswood and it's a fascinating structure. But I wanted to emphasise the emptiness of the landscape, covered in mist in the early morning, to match that feeling of desolation when I was standing in this building. With only a doorway and 3 windows with no roof, I had lots of opportunity to frame the landscape outside using the structure. My aim was to create contrast between the old weathered concrete structure and landscape, which was softened by that early morning mist. Max Dupain is perhaps the most famous for his sunbather photograph. However, I'm always amazed by his ability to capture architecture in a creative manner. Using a wide lens, or a wide angle lens, and shooting from the stairs leading towards the tower in Australia Square, Dupain frames this building within the exit from the covered stairs. The keyhole shape is formed from the top of the stairwell because of the use of the wide lens. Vertical lines of the tower converge towards the top, creating a deep perspective as the tower seems to rise endlessly towards the sky. They are enclosed successfully and completely within the frame. In this photograph, the trees become not only a natural frame, but also play the part as a contrast to the subject, the high-rise building. Finally, I've included 3 views of the same building photographed by Ansel Adams in Mexico. I wanted to demonstrate how the change of angle or vantage point could change completely the outcome of a photograph. Ansel has used the same doorway in each photograph, but as he moves around, different area of the building is framed within the doorway. This has produced 3 very different photographs. The key to using this compositional element frame or framing is observation. Look for opportunities. Windows, doorways are always available. You may be able to place the subject between natural elements or similar colour. When you practice this technique, remember to move around, step in and out from the subject, include more or less of whatever you're using as a frame in the photograph. Try to keep the vertical and horizontal lines straight if that's what if you want that formality within the image. Next, I'd like to talk about unity in a photograph. So unity in a photograph occurs when all the elements of a piece combine to make a balanced, harmonious, complete whole. Unity is one of those hard to describe terms, but when it's present, your eye and your brain are pleased to see it. The photograph may be quite busy or contain many elements. However, it is by creating a relationship between these elements that you can create unity. Composing the photograph so the elements become ordered is one way of creating unity. Although there may be a variation of size, shape, colour and texture in the photograph, the manner in which you capture or organise these elements may produce an image where they appear to belong together. At first glance, this Nick Rain photograph of a man brushing his hair, the scene appears to be in chaos. However, once we start to examine the photograph, the eye begins to move between the elements and the underlying structure is discovered. Man standing with light-coloured clothes is the centre of interest. Even the way his arms form a triangular composition pointing both towards his face and then to the right-hand side of the photograph assists the viewer to begin to move through the photograph and link the individual elements together. The eye is led to a line running down the right-hand side of the frame until it reaches the bottom edge. The denser tones of the shaded area running horizontally along the bottom of the photograph takes the eye to the left-hand side of the image. It is at this point a series of circular shapes encircle the second man who is sitting. He appears to be surrounded by multiple shapes which at first glance bear no relationship to each other. However, it's the similarity of shape which brings this group together. The final part of the composition is two holes and a line between them on the back wall. These elements close the composition. The structure of the concrete area where the men are placed appears as two rectangles, which provides a frame within the frame of the photograph supporting all the other elements of this very busy but totally unified photograph. Looking at this André Cartez photograph, can you see how he has composed the image so that the viewer moves through the winter landscape? The photograph is a great example of how to use line and repeated pattern to create unity in a photograph. Unity is achieved firstly through the monochrome image, so there is no bright colour and only a limited tonal range in the photograph as well. It is that repeated and rhythmic graphic forms of the fence line, walking path, street lamps and trees which are able to work cohesively for Cartez to bring complete unity to a photograph which could have failed in the hands of a less experienced photographer. Finally, in a final example, a brightly coloured photograph from Joseph Holmes still works as a unified image. It's the repetition of colour and shape of the tree trunks, the main elements, embedded into that background of bright autumn foliage. The tree trunks, all the same colour, lead the eye through the photograph from left hand to right. The warm colour of the autumn foliage becomes one background texture, more so than a pattern. It's not the dominant element. As a detail here, do you notice that the first tree on the far left of the photograph is a little closer and larger than the others? Perhaps this is the starting point. Now we'll have a look at another compositional principle, which is balance. You may be mistaken to believe balance is symmetry. However, it's a little bit more complex concept than that. It's about the design or organisation of all the elements in a photograph so that they are in proportion to each other. It's about the careful distribution of visual weight in a photograph. The compositional element of balance may be either symmetrical or asymmetrical. At times, photographers may also use non-balance to create tension between the viewer and the image. Balance may also be described as negative and positive space. So let's look at some examples. Each element was very carefully placed to create sense of order in this photograph, because it is all about symmetry and balance. From the placement of the trees around the main subject, the young man, through the detail of his hands, the garden shears, which frame the subject, the shape of the jacket and the white shirt, each element is symmetrical shape, composed in a symmetrical fashion. This photograph was a statement about teenagers wanting to shape the world to their vision instead of conforming to the ubiquitous vision of others. The next photograph is from Loretta Lux, and once again it's about that symmetrical balance. It's very easy to identify in this photograph. The two girls placed to the centre of frame and evenly spaced between them and the edge of the frame. Perhaps it's simple to recognise symmetry and balance with two objects of the same size and visual weight, But what about a single object in the frame? The Michael Canner photograph of a tree is beautifully symmetrical. The tree, once again, centred and singular against the snow, is a similar visual weight left and right of the central axis. So symmetry is easy to identify and replicate, but what about asymmetrical balance? Cartier-Bresson stated that he saw the world in geometric shapes. What a wonderful example of using geometric shape and form to create balance in this photograph. Background shapes balance wonderfully with the subject centred and placed forward of the frame. There's a strong range of tones in the photograph. The window light creates strong lighting to the left-hand side of the subject's face, and then low contrast tonality across the background. This photograph encourages the reader to read from right to left, light to dark. Do you notice the shadow on the left-hand side of the subject's face is placed in front of the highlighted form of the light shade? Cartier-Bresson designed each photograph very carefully. He watched and waited until the exact moment the photograph was ready to take. In this Loretta Lux photograph, this time she uses asymmetrical balance. The two subjects, child and cat, are placed evenly central to the axis, but they are different visual weights. Symmetrical and asymmetrical balance are both used to create harmony in your photography. Non-balance is normally associated with subject matter, where the photographer wants to create a feeling of tension or an unease with the viewer. The subject matter is usually of more controversial nature. You'll see evidence of non-balance in the following images. First is from James Nutchway. So the child front of frame is too large. His scale is out of balance to the rest of the deserted street. And the next one, Don McCullen, and where it's people fleeing from a massacre site. Once again, there's that feeling of disorder. It's just like a snapshot aesthetic, but it makes you feel like there is no control in that photograph. So how do you, as a new photographer, begin to know how and where to place elements or subject matter in a photograph? Luckily, there's quite a bit of theory out there to start you on your way. The theory may be known as principles of image design or composition. Next in this lecture, I'd like to introduce you to a number of these principles, including rule of thirds, golden section, golden mean, golden ratio, and Fibonacci. Then we'll quickly talk about centre of interest and how using these principles may assist you in creating well-designed photographs. So when I speak about the principles of composition, what I'm referring to is a number of concepts or theories which refer to the organisation or how we place compositional elements within a photograph. That is, that the principles of composition and their underpinning concepts are less about the individual elements and more about the placement of those elements to create interesting and visually appealing photographs, or as indicated, how to create tension or unbalance in a photograph. These principles should never be considered as rules, but rather guidelines. These theories are based on how we see and how we interpret the world around us. They are visual language. It's through this visual language we as photographers can embed meaning or narrative in our work. And this is the same language which the viewer will also use to interpret or understand what they are seeing. Theories regarding what is considered beauty have been around since early civilization. In ancient Greece, Aristotle described how beauty was to be found in order and balance. One of the most important contemporary theories relating to visual language is Gestalt theory. Gestalt means shape or form. The use of compositional principles is a way to avoid ambiguity in your photographs. These principles describe how compositional elements are placed within the camera view. The principles also deal with how elements interact with each other. Compositional principles provide us with a language not only to create successful photographs, but also view and understand photographs. So the first principle I'd like to introduce you today is rule of thirds. So this describes a method of composing photographs using imaginary lines within the camera view. 3 lines running horizontally and vertically split the image into 9 identical parts. The compositional principle rule of thirds suggests that by placing the important elements of the photograph on either one of the intersection points of these lines or aligning it with one of the lines will create a well-designed and balanced photograph. Primarily, you would use this principle to compose photographs in camera. However, it's also useful when in post-production you want to revisit the cropping of an image. Some cameras provide a grid visible through the viewfinder to aid the photographer in visualising the placement of elements within the photograph. I've always set my cameras up this way, and it just helps me to compose well, but also keeps my horizons straight. The most important attribute applying rule of thirds when photographing is that it allows you to pre-visualise the placement of dominant and secondary elements in the photograph. This is possible as it breaks the view up into 3 equal size horizontal and vertical areas. You have the option to place your primary subject in any of these areas. Rule of thirds is a way to bring balance to your photograph and is an important concept of image design. Rule of thirds creates visual energy. That is, the elements are equally placed within the photograph and the areas of the photograph off-centre, meaning that I must travel through or past other areas to the main subject. By placing the main compositional element on an intersection of these lines or in alignment with either the horizontal or vertical line, you'll find that the image becomes much more dynamic. Why is that so? It's because these intersects or divisions are placed at intervals where the eye quite naturally falls. That is, remember, we read from left to right, top to bottom. The imaginary lines associated with rule of thirds also conform with this notion. When applying the principle of rule of thirds, the feature of the image should fall at one of the intersection points or align with a horizontal vertical line. This is by no means a rule, but a general guideline to assist producing well-balanced photographs. It assists the new photographer to develop skills in image design. Studies show that the eye naturally moves across an image left to right and top to bottom. This roughly translates to align with the lines and intersection points if an image is designed using the concept rule of thirds. By limiting the main subject to only one area of the photograph using rule of thirds as a guide, you can create balance, order and dominance between the elements visible in the camera. For example, when photographing in the landscape, it's quite natural to want to place a horizon running through the centre of frame. However, if you do so, the horizon becomes the subject of the photograph. Aligning the horizon with either the upper or lower horizontal line will result in a much more dramatic photograph. If you want to make the sky dominant subject of the photograph, it's quite simple to move the horizon down the lower third of the photograph. To make the foreground focus or dominant area, then align the horizon to the upper third of the photograph. It works in a similar manner when in a vertical alignment of the compositional elements as well. By placing the subject or object at the intersection of one of the horizontal and vertical lines, it does become a dominant element. Applying this principle creates space around the subject matter and in turn an aesthetically pleasing composition. Rule of thirds is a really simple guideline for the student photographer to assist with the pre-visualisation and placement of elements in a photograph. Some photographers strictly adhere to this principle and use it as a basis for their style. However, as I said, it's not a rule, it's just a guide. Golden ratio and golden mean are the base knowledge for the less complex rule of thirds, but they're very similar concepts. As I said in my introduction, rule of thirds is grounded historically to other disciplines such as science, mathematics, philosophy and aesthetics. And so I'll provide a brief introduction to composition principle, golden ratio, golden rectangle and golden mean. However, they can become quite complex academic topics. In mathematics, two quantities are in golden ratio if their ratio of the smaller quantity is the same as the ratio of their sum to the larger two quantities. That is, the ratio of the larger part is the same as the larger and the smaller together. This is illustrated nicely in the golden rectangle. Golden rectangle with the longer side A and shorter side B, when placed next to a square, will produce a similar golden rectangle with the longer side A and B in the shorter side. That is, the ratio of the original rectangle is the same as the ratio of the larger rectangle formed with the two adjacent squares. But we're all photographers, so how does this relate to photography and specifically to rule of thirds? The golden ratio is thought to be aesthetically pleasing. That is, we see it as harmonious and balanced. The ratio has been found and seen as universal law in nature. Golden ratio is associated with golden mean or golden section. Golden mean is a term from ancient Greek philosophy which describes the middle between two extremes. The ancient Greeks, especially Aristotle, thought that there were three attributes to beauty. They are symmetry, proportion, and harmony. Golden mean is a fantastic visualization of this concept, and it's very similar to rule of thirds. So in essence, golden ratio, golden mean, and golden section all describe what is the middle between two extremes. It refers to a wonderfully balanced manner of placing visual elements in a photograph. So the final of these ancient concepts is Fibonacci. Interestingly, Fibonacci was a mathematician from the 12th century who created a sequence of numbers when calculating the expansion of pairs of rabbits over a year. So what's that got to do with photography? This sequence of numbers is firmly based in mathematics. However, what it does describe in nature is a little uncanny. This equation is now regarded as a numerical representation of beauty in the visual arts and design. Fibonacci is that mathematical equation linked to the golden ratio and golden mean sequence, and it's also that numerical representation of the golden ratio. So when you look at this illustration of Fibonacci numbers and then take a pen and draw linking each of the intersection of the tiles, you should form a spiral. You've created the golden spiral. Division of tiles, 5 to 8, represents the golden rectangle. In nature you can see examples of Fibonacci. If you look inside this nautilus shell, you'll see that beautiful natural representation of the spiral. Take a close-up look at the seeds in this sunflower and it will show that same spiral. The ratio in these natural formations conforms to the Fibonacci sequence. Fibonacci sequence is evident in natural form, and as photographers and artists you can use this knowledge to create beautiful work. This is an interesting and enduring topic. Golden ratio, golden mean and Fibonacci are fascinating. Take the time to investigate these a little bit further. However, always remember these concepts do not create a set of rules for composition. They're a way of understanding what we see and what we consider to be aesthetically pleasing balance between elements. These ideas have been part of an ongoing discussion and used extensively by artists and architects for centuries. The Swiss architect Le Corbusier was famous for his modernist international style, which was based on the philosophy of harmony and proportion. His design system bound to the golden ratio and Fibonacci. So, rule of thirds, golden ratio, and golden mean describes the relationship between long and short, wide and narrow, the more and less. Finally, before we move away from this subject, let's look at some photographs created using the compositional principle rule of thirds. First photograph of an abandoned house. The house hadn't been lived in for about 30 years, with the last residents two elderly men. And when they both passed away, the family didn't move or touch the house in that 30 years until I walked into it. So it was like a time capsule. When I walked into the kitchen, what struck me was the table and chair. The chair was pushed back from the table at an angle as if someone had just stepped away from the table. It was really quite spooky. After I looked around the room, I noticed other objects such as the old radio left on the stove top and Except for all the surfaces and objects were covered in dirt. One could think that there was still someone in residence. But for me, as a photographer, the most important element in this photograph was that table and the chair pushed back. Luckily, there was a beautiful high contrast light coming in through a side window which picked up the texture of the dirt on the table. The dirt was so thick it had begun to crack, which created a second layer of texture. I decided to place the chair and the table to the lower left-hand side of the image. As I composed the photograph, my eye was drawn to the texture on the table and then to where the chair intersects towards the end of the table. After that, my eye transfers to the other objects in the room. When photographing, especially architectural or interiors, I'm very much influenced by that compositional principle, rule of thirds. I like to put things into order and balance. I also hope that it will assist my viewer to read the narrative of the image using that visual language. If you read this Nick Brandt photograph using your knowledge of rule of thirds, then one could surmise that the photographer wanted to make the male line the most important or dominant element in the photograph. The lion's face falls neatly in that top right-hand side intersect of a horizontal and vertical line. The lioness is a secondary element providing some context to the photograph. If you draw an imaginary line between their faces and then moving down horizontally across the rocks at their feet, it forms a rough triangular form. This triangular composition, implied by proximity to each other, suggests a relationship between the subject. This is a dynamic concept which is used commonly in portraiture. Look what happens when I apply the Fibonacci spiral to this image. The male lion's face falls beautifully within the spiral, which then fans out to encompass the lioness in the composition. This next photograph is from a series that I also took about 2009, and it was about children being asked to conform to societal constraints. In this body of work, I was experimenting with the placement of children strictly using that compositional principle rule of thirds. I even went as far as creating a window frame to use in the studio with 9 even-size openings to replicate that formal grid of rule of thirds. Not only has Michael Levin placed this element at the right-hand side intersection of the lines, but he's also separated this element from the background through the use of tonal range. That is, the background elements are much lighter than the structure in the front. The square or 1-to-1 aspect ratio creates an extra level of stillness and formality to this photograph. In this photograph from Michael Kenner, the sky is the most dramatic element in the image. By aligning the horizon and the other vertical elements to the lower third of the image, he has given the sky dominance. Looking through your camera, can you visualize the view for you broken into 9 equal areas? Can you identify where the intersect points are? Take some photographs and on the computer observe the placement of the main subject. Is it within these lines or at an intersect point? Do you do this naturally? Experiment with the same subject placed at different points and lines within the frame. Remember, rule of thirds, it's not a rule. It's a general guide to assist the photographer. Next, I'd like to talk to you just for a moment about centre of interest. Centre of interest refers to a dominant element in a photograph. It should be clearly identifiable. If you design or compose your photograph successfully, there should be no ambiguity as to the topic of the photograph. The viewer should be drawn to one area of the image immediately. The dominance may be created through the placement of an element or the size, the shape, the colour tone of that element. So photographs should also have only one principal topic or idea. Otherwise, the meaning may become ambiguous. That's a centre of interest. So a centre of interest is what your photograph's about. Centre of interest in your photograph should be specific and obvious. If you have supplementary or secondary subjects, they must support the principal element, not create conflict. The viewer should also be able to clearly identify what is the most important element in the photograph, what you're trying to convey in the photograph. You can do this by using the skills you've learnt to date regarding composition, elements, principles, or ideas, concepts such as rule of thirds. Ambiguity makes for rather confusing photographs. Before you take a photograph, ask yourself, what am I photographing? What do I want my photograph to say? What's it about? If you can't answer that, then the viewer will also be lost. The simplest way to understand centre of interest is to look at some good examples. This Tracy Moffat photograph conforms beautifully with compositional principle rule of thirds, and so it makes it really easy to unpack the underlying story and to get to the centre of interest. The graphic elements of the building and the painted landscape behind the characters support the central subject beautifully. Do you notice how the photograph seems to be broken into 3 individual areas, each with their own sub-narrative? The woman to the front is the centre of interest. It's what the photograph's about. She is separated from the background by her location and occupies the centre third of the photograph by herself. To the right and framed within the doorway of the hut are the second most important subjects of the photograph. All the characters are looking to her, so this is also indicating where we should look as well. Before we leave the topic centre of interest, I'd like to show you something quite different. So this photograph by Oscar Rylander in 1857 is a combination of 32 different photographs taken on film. Actually, it's probably glass plate back in 1850. It took Rylander 6 weeks to complete this epic task. But what I want you to see is, and what I want to bring your attention to, is how Rylander has used compositional elements and principles to create this allegorical photograph, The Two Ways of Life. The image is about 2 young men who are offered guidance by an older man about life choices. On one side is the life of sinful pleasure and the other virtuous pleasure. But when we're looking at how the photographs are produced and what compositional elements and principles may assist in getting one's point of view across to the viewer and what is the centre of interest. The photograph may well have many small areas, each one beautifully designed, and as we read an entire or whole, produce one strong narrative. There is only one idea here, and it's all about choice. So even though it's quite a complex, fragmented image, it's about bringing those all those fragmented pieces together through using these principles of composition to create one singular narrative. Let's have a look at a really contemporary photographer. So Gerard O'Connor is a real character. He's an advertising and fashion photographer out of Melbourne. Can you see the similarity of style between his work and Rylander's? And can you also see how O'Connor has used his knowledge of composition and image design in this photograph to once again bring together a narrative? Interestingly, O'Connor made the photograph in a similar fashion to Rylander, because each one of those scenes or those characters are photographed separately in studio, and then they're brought together in post-production. Centre of interest does not mean the central point of the photograph. That is, the subject matter does not need to be placed centrally in the frame. What it is referring to is a central idea, a topic, one that is easily identifiable to the viewer by using compositional visual language or compositional principles. What is it referring to as a central idea or a topic, one that is easily identifiable to the viewer by using compositional principles to embed visual language into the photograph.